I don't know how many winters I counted with my eyes wide open, trembling under damp newspapers and the cold breath of the wind sneaking into my bones like an uninvited witness. I only know that when the war ended, my own war had only just begun. I came back from the Pacific in 1945, not to a home, but to a New York that barely remembered me. The city pulsed with neon lights, jazz spilling out of bars, and people rushing forward as if nothing had ever happened overseas. In the inside pocket of my jacket, I carried a letter, the last one I ever received from her, with shaky handwriting and the promise that she would wait. But there was no house, no woman, no promise left when I returned. For years, I slept wherever I could. Park benches in Brooklyn, under the eaves of old warehouses by the East River, in the hollow silence of abandoned subway stations. I became one of the forgotten, a face the city glanced past, a shadow swallowed by the noise of traffic and the clatter of trains. Sometimes I wondered if my name had died on the beaches of Iwo Jima or in the jungles of the Philippines, erased from the world as if I had never been. And yet, I never let go of that letter. I carried it close to my chest until the paper grew soft with sweat and time. It was heavier than any medal they pinned on me in the service. It was proof that once someone had waited for me, someone had believed I'd come back alive. But when I crossed the avenues of this restless city, no one asked about William. No one asked what I had seen or what I had lost. People built their lives upward, in towers of glass and brick, while I drifted lower, closer to the ground, closer to silence. Nights bled into mornings without difference. I woke to the sound of garbage trucks, church bells, or just the numb hum of the city that never cared. My hands were cracked, my hair grew wild, and my eyes sank deeper into shadows. Sometimes the smell of smoke in the air would snap me awake, and I couldn't tell if it was the city burning again or just my dreams dragging me back to the war. Each morning I pulled myself together for another day of being unseen, as if survival were nothing more than endurance without purpose. Until that one afternoon. It was September, sharp and cold, the kind of day where the air feels thin and your breath comes out like ghosts. I was sitting on my usual bench, collar turned up, watching the leaves spiral down like tiny, rust-colored flames. That's when I heard it. A voice, a child's voice, clear, unbroken, carrying through the park with a certainty that cut me open. It called my name. Not Sir, not some half-forgotten nickname, but my full name, the way she used to say it. For 1 second, my heart stopped. My chest clenched, and I wondered if I was already gone, if maybe this was death calling me gently back. But the boy was real, standing in front of me with eyes too familiar, too piercing. For the first time in years, I felt alive again. If this story touches you the way it touched me as I wrote it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep sharing stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. New York was not the same city I had left behind when I was drafted in 1941. Back then, the avenues felt alive, buzzing with trolley cars and newsboys shouting headlines, the smell of roasted chestnuts on winter corners, the easy rhythm of people who still believed the future was theirs. When I returned in 1945, the war was over, at least for them, but for me the city was a stranger, dressed in familiar clothes. The skyline had grown higher, steel skeletons rising where old brick tenements had once stood, and yet beneath the shine of neon, there lingered shadows that no one else seemed to notice. I walked through streets that should have felt like home, but instead I recognized them only by memory, not by sight. There was the bakery where I once bought sweet rolls on Sundays. Gone now, replaced by a diner with chrome stools and fluorescent lights that made everyone's face look pale. There was the corner where my friend Mark used to wait for me before we went off to ball games. The building had been torn down, the lot fenced off, as if our laughter had never echoed there. I realized with every step that the city had moved on without me, that it had built over my memories the way it built over ruins, fast and merciless. People, too, had changed. They rushed past with their briefcases and their babies, their heads bent forward, their mouths full of plans for the future. The young ones didn't carry the war in their eyes. They carried records under their arms, jitterbugging in the streets, as though the 4 years overseas had been nothing more than a headline in a history book. The older ones carried silence, a silence so heavy you could feel it pressing down when you stood too close. They didn't ask questions anymore. Not about who had come back, not about who hadn't. Maybe they were afraid of the answers, or maybe forgetting had simply become easier than remembering. For weeks, I drifted through the city like a ghost, haunting the places I used to know. Sometimes I caught reflections of myself in the windows of stores, and I startled at the stranger staring back, hollow-eyed, hair unkempt, shoulders hunched as if still carrying a rifle pack. I knew that the city saw me the same way. Not as William, who had once danced on stoops and courted a girl with letters, but as a ragged vagrant, another forgotten veteran blending into the alleys and park benches. One day, in a bread line near a church basement, I saw her. Not the woman I had lost, but Mrs. Harris, the neighbor who used to watch me and my brothers when we were kids. She had the same scarf tied over her head, though the years had pulled her shoulders down and traced new lines around her eyes. I stepped toward her, my heart beating as if I were walking into battle again, because I feared she wouldn't recognize me, that I would stand there exposed and invisible at once. When she finally lifted her gaze and met mine, I saw confusion first, the way someone stares at a face that belongs to the dead. Then her eyes widened, and she whispered, "Billy? My God, we thought you were killed on the islands." The words hit me harder than any bullet ever could. To hear out loud what I already suspected, that to the world I had been gone for years, erased, mourned, buried in memory while I was still breathing, left me numb. I tried to speak, but my mouth went dry. She filled the silence, as though afraid that if she stopped, I might vanish again. She told me about her, about the woman I had loved, the one whose letter I still carried like a relic. She had married 2 years after my last note had reached her. She had a son now. Her husband was a tailor, a decent man, steady and kind. I felt the words pressing against my ribs like knives. The letter in my pocket burned, as though it wanted to leap out and protest, to remind the world that a promise had once been made. But I stood there silent, my chest tight, listening as Mrs. Harris spoke gently, not knowing that every syllable was striking me down. I thanked her quietly and walked away. That night I roamed the city until my legs nearly gave out. New York glowed with new buildings, new businesses, new lives rising on top of what had been lost. People said it was a sign of strength, a promise that the future would be brighter. For me, every brick laid was a reminder that the past had been covered over, that there was no place left for the man who had once belonged there. What haunted me most was not the skyline, nor the crowds, nor even the silence of strangers, but the thought of her hands, the same hands that had mended the collar of my uniform before I shipped out, the same hands that had held mine with the trembling weight of hope. Those hands were now busy elsewhere, holding a child, smoothing the fabric of another man's coat. That night, I sat again on my bench in the park. Children ran by, chasing one another, their laughter echoing like something from another lifetime. One little girl stopped and stared at me with curiosity, but her mother pulled her away, glancing at me the way people look at drunks or beggars. They didn't see the soldier who had fought, bled, and lost everything. They only saw what was left. Above me, the sky stretched wide and grey, without stars, without light. I wondered how many men like me wandered these streets, unseen, carrying letters in their pockets, carrying promises that never found their way home. And I realized then that the city had rebuilt without me. It had no doors left open, no keys waiting in a lock. It was alive, thriving, moving forward. And I was nothing but its shadow. There are nights when the memories come back like a tide I cannot hold back, when I close my eyes and tell myself I am safe, that the city around me hums with taxis and jazz, not with gunfire, and yet the sound of the ocean waves turns into the crashing of mortars, the cries of gulls become the cries of the wounded, and I am dragged back to the Pacific as if the war had never ended. I remember one night on a small island near Okinawa, a night so unnaturally quiet that it seemed as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Silence was rare in those jungles, where the air usually rang with gunshots, shouted orders, and the buzz of flies over the fallen. But that night, the silence wrapped around us like a shroud, and in that fragile stillness, I pulled out a scrap of paper and began to write to her. My hands shook, not from fear that night, but from cold and exhaustion. The rain had soaked through everything, and the paper was soft, tearing under the tip of my pencil. Yet I wrote anyway. I told her to wait for me. I promised I would return. I wrote about the children we dreamed of having, about the little house near the river we had once spoken of, about the future I believed we still had, because if I wrote those words, if I pressed them into the page, then the future had to exist. Writing was a way of building a bridge back home, plank by plank, word by word. Next to me sat Mark, my closest friend in the unit, the kind of man who kept everyone laughing even when we hadn't eaten in days. He too was writing, though his letter was to a wife he had married only months before the war swallowed us both. He carried her photograph everywhere, folded and refolded until the edges were worn soft, but he would take it out every night, kiss it once, and tuck it back into his breast pocket before he picked up his rifle. That photograph was his shield, his reason to survive. I can still see him in my mind. A few days later, he fell beside me during an ambush. The bullet struck fast, and when I turned to him, he was already slipping away, his hand clutching that same photograph as though it could carry him across. His blood seeped into the ground, warm and sticky on my hands, and I thought for a moment it was my own life pouring out. Something inside me broke then. I tucked my own letter back into my jacket, unable to send it, terrified that if I let it leave my hands, it would be lost forever, just like him. So I carried that letter everywhere, through the battles, through the retreats and advances, through the suffocating nights in foxholes and the endless marches through mud. It grew tattered, stained with sweat and dirt, but I could not part with it. As long as I kept it close, the promise I had written remained alive, but the war kept grinding on. Days and months blurred together in a haze of gunpowder, hunger, and fear. I lost track of time, of the dates I meant to mark, and sometimes even of my own name. We became less like men and more like shadows carrying rifles. I remember lying awake, listening to the rain pound against the leaves, listening to the silence between shelling, and realizing that silence could be worse than noise. Because in silence, your thoughts grew loud. You thought of home, of faces you might never see again, of promises you might never keep. It was during the Battle of Okinawa that shrapnel tore through my leg. The pain was so sharp I thought the world had ended, but worse than the wound was the hospital afterward, the endless rows of men broken like me, staring up at the ceiling with eyes that no longer believed in tomorrow. We were patched, bandaged, given morphine when it was available, but no one could patch the emptiness we carried. I lay there for weeks, staring at the rafters, wondering why I was still alive when so many better men were not. It was there, in that military hospital, that I rewrote the letter. The old one was too dirty, too fragile, too soaked with blood and mud to be delivered. I forced my hand to write the words again, though they came out shakier than before. I told her I was alive, that I was coming back, that I still believed in our future. And this time, I sent it. The reply came weeks later, slipped under my pillow by a nurse. It was short, painfully short. I waited as long as I could. Please forgive me. That was all. No long explanations, no anger, just a final silence folded into a few words. I bent the letter in half, then in half again, and tucked it with the first one because I couldn't bear to throw it away. Together they became the only truth I carried, heavier than the medals pinned on me when I was discharged, heavier than the crutches they gave me when I tried to walk again. Even now, all these years later, I sometimes hear Mark's voice in my head telling me to hold on, to live, because someone was waiting. And in those moments, I cry quietly where no one can see, because I know no one waits anymore. The war took Mark's wife's laughter. It took the woman I loved. It took the years I cannot get back. And yet, when I press my hand to my chest and feel the outline of those folded papers, I know that once, at least once, I was loved. Once, I was someone's whole world. And though the war shattered everything else, it could not erase that truth. There were days when I told myself it was better not to know, better to keep my distance, better to accept that her life had taken a different path and that mine had been buried under years of silence and hunger. I told myself that to follow her, even from afar, was to open wounds that would never heal. And yet the longer I drifted through the streets of New York, the harder it became to resist the pull of memory. Because memory is not a chain you can cut. It is a tide that drags you back again and again to the shore of what you have lost. So one evening, when the sky turned copper over the Brooklyn rooftops and the air smelled faintly of coal smoke and rain, I followed her. My heart pounded against my ribs with each step, as if I were marching into combat once more, though there was no enemy here except my own fear. I kept to the shadows, ashamed of myself, and yet unable to stop, because a part of me believed that if I saw her face, even from a distance, I might remember who I had once been. I watched her unlock the gate of a modest brownstone. There was a small garden out front, with roses planted in neat rows, the kind of garden she used to dream about when we were young. And then I saw him, a boy, running across the yard, his laughter ringing out so clearly that it made my knees weak. There was something in the way he moved, the way his arms flailed with abandon, that struck me as familiar, though I could not name it at first. I stood frozen, watching as she bent down to greet him, smoothing his hair, kissing his forehead. A man came up the steps, carrying a bundle of flowers. Her husband, the tailor Mrs. Harris had mentioned. He looked gentle, solid, the kind of man who built a life with steady hands, rather than with promises scrawled in pencil from across an ocean. She smiled at him in a way that made my chest ache, for it was a smile I had once believed was mine alone. And in that moment I knew, with a crushing clarity, that this picture would never include me. I left before they could see me, my chest tight, my legs carrying me without direction. I told myself I had no right to intrude. That was their life, their world, not mine. But fate has a way of refusing silence. Some weeks later, I found myself sleeping near a schoolyard fence, wrapped in my coat against the chill. Two women stopped by the nearby stoop, their voices carrying in the still air. I tried not to listen, but their words seemed aimed straight at me. They were talking about her boy, the same boy I had seen in the garden. "He looks just like his father," one of them said. The other woman paused, lowering her voice. "You mean her husband?" "No," the first answered quietly. "Not him. Everyone knows." I froze. The world tilted under me, the ground slipping away as though I were falling again into one of those shell craters on the islands. My mind raced, calculating dates I had never dared to count. The boy was about 8. That lined up exactly with my last visit before shipping out, with the night we spent together as rain pounded against the windows, when we clung to each other, as if by holding tighter we could stop time itself. The memory struck me with such force that I had to steady myself against the fence. I could see her again, the glow of the lamp on her hair, the warmth of her skin against mine, the way we whispered promises into the darkness, believing we had forever. That night, I realized, had never left either of us. It had taken shape in the laughter of a child I had no claim to. My body trembled with the weight of the discovery. Could it be true? Could he be mine? If so, what right did I have to him now? What good could come from stepping into his life with a truth that would tear apart the only family he had ever known? I wanted to run to her, to demand an answer, to see her eyes and know for certain. But my courage failed me. I thought of the boy's small hands, his innocent smile, the security of the world she had built for him. Did I have the right to shatter that? Did love give me permission to steal peace from a child? So I said nothing. I carried the secret inside me like another scar, invisible but heavy, pressed close to my heart alongside the letters I never let go. I walked the streets of New York as if the knowledge might spill out of me, but no one saw it. No one ever does. People glance at you, see only rags and unwashed hair, and they think that is your whole story. They never imagine the lives you once held in your hands, the futures that were once yours. Every time I saw him after that, playing in the yard or walking to school, I felt torn in two, pride and sorrow battling in my chest. Pride because, if the whispers were true, my blood lived on in him, in his quick smile and restless energy. Sorrow because I would never hear him call me father, never sit at a table with him, never guide him through the storms of life. And yet, maybe love is not always about claiming what is yours. Maybe sometimes it is about silence, about letting others live in the light while you remain in the shadows. That was the hardest battle of all, harder than Okinawa, harder than the nights of hunger and fear. To love and remain silent, to know and never speak, to accept that your greatest truth may have to live only within your own heart. It was one of those afternoons that began like any other, grey and unremarkable, the kind of day you pass without noticing, and yet it carried within it the weight of a turning point I could never have foreseen. I was sitting on my usual park bench, collar pulled high against the September wind, watching the leaves tumble down in slow spirals, when suddenly I heard it. A voice, high and clear, slicing through the stillness with a sound I had not expected to hear again in my lifetime. The voice called my name. Not sir, not some casual nickname, but my full name, the way she used to say it, each syllable pronounced with a kind of certainty that made my chest tighten. I lifted my head and saw a boy standing in front of me, his cheeks flushed from running, his hair tousled by the breeze. His eyes, God, his eyes, were green, deep and bright, exactly like hers, the eyes I had carried in memory for so many years. For a moment I could not breathe, because it felt as if time had folded back on itself, delivering me into the presence of both past and future at once. "You're William, aren't you?" He asked, his voice direct and innocent, as though he had always known me, as though we were not strangers at all. "My mum has a picture of you." Before I could answer, I saw her approaching, walking toward us with slow, measured steps, as though each footfall cost her strength. Her face was older, of course. Time had softened some lines, deepened others, but her eyes were unchanged. The same eyes that had once sent me off to war with promises that we both believed in, the same eyes that haunted me through every battle and every night alone. Our gazes met, and in that instant the years collapsed. I saw her as she had been, and as she was now, all at once. She stopped a few feet away, pale, her lips parting as if she meant to speak, but could not. The silence between us said more than words could. Finally, in a voice low and trembling, she said, "He always wanted to know who the man from the letter was. I never thought I'd see you again." I reached into my coat pocket with a hand that shook, not from cold, but from the unbearable weight of what I carried. I pulled out the letter, worn thin from years, pressed against my heart, edges frayed, ink smudged, a relic of a promise too fragile to survive the world. I held it out to her. Her hand trembled as she took it, as if the paper burned her skin, yet she unfolded it carefully. She read only a few lines before tears welled in her eyes, spilling silently down her cheeks. Seeing her cry after all these years, not in grief but in recognition, was more than I could bear. I wanted to reach out, to wipe the tears away, but my hand remained at my side, bound by all the years of silence between us. The boy looked from her to me, his brow furrowed in confusion, and then he slipped his small hand into mine. The warmth of his grip, the unthinking trust of that gesture, pierced me deeper than any wound I had ever taken. There were no accusations, no shouting, no explanations offered or demanded. Perhaps we had lost too much already to waste time on blame. Perhaps we both understood that war had stolen from us what no words could restore. All that remained was this: a boy holding my hand, a woman holding my letter, 3 lives bound together by a truth none of us dared to speak aloud. She said softly, almost whispering, "He doesn't need to know everything, but I wanted him to know there was someone like you." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. I knew she was right. Some truths are too heavy for a child to bear, and this was not his burden. He deserved joy, laughter, and the love of the man who had raised him, not the weight of history and broken promises. After a long pause, she folded the letter again, carefully, as though it were a living thing, and held it against her chest. She looked at me one last time, her eyes full of sorrow and something else. Not love, not anymore, but a kind of tenderness, the recognition of what we once shared. Then she turned, gently guiding the boy by the shoulder. But before they walked away, he looked back at me, smiled, and waved. It was such a simple gesture, yet it carried within it the possibility of forgiveness, of connection, of a bond unspoken but undeniable. I sat there long after they were gone, staring at my empty hand where his had been, feeling the echo of his touch as if it still lingered. For the first time in years, I felt something shift inside me, something fragile but real. I did not ask for a place in their lives, and I knew I would never have one. But in that brief encounter, I had been seen, not as a shadow, not as a vagrant, but as a man who once loved, and perhaps as a man whose love had left something behind in the world. I did not ask for anything that day. I did not demand a place in their lives, nor did I beg for forgiveness, because I knew that time had already written its verdict, and there are promises the world refuses to keep, no matter how tightly we hold them. And yet, something within me shifted after that encounter. The city was still the same, the benches still cold, the nights still long, but I no longer felt entirely invisible. A boy had spoken my name aloud, and in that sound I heard proof that I had not been erased completely. In the weeks that followed, small things began to change. Every so often, I would find a piece of bread wrapped in paper on the windowsill of the church shelter where I sometimes slept, or a folded note slipped into the pocket of my coat when I wasn't looking. She never signed them, but I knew. Sometimes it was only a line. "He did well on his exam," or "He's learning to play the piano." Simple words, but they warmed me more than any blanket. They reminded me that though the past could not be reclaimed, some part of me still reached into the present. She never called me love again, never spoke of what we had been, and I never asked her to. But when our paths crossed, in the park or on the street, her eyes softened, and for a moment we were not two strangers bound by silence, but two people who once carried each other's entire world. That was enough. The boy, though, he came often. At first, shy, uncertain, but soon with the eagerness only children can have. He called me Mr. Bill, and in that title was a mix of respect and affection that felt more precious than anything the war had left me. He asked questions about things I had long forgotten how to talk about, what it felt like to be young, what the ocean looked like at night, why people write letters instead of just speaking their hearts. One day, he brought a notebook with blank pages and asked me to teach him how to write a letter. "I want to write one that makes my mom smile the way yours did," he said, and my throat closed around the weight of his words. We sat together on the bench, and I guided his small hand across the page, showing him how to fold his thoughts into sentences, how to leave space for silence, how to give words the power to cross distances that nothing else can. In that moment, I felt as though I had passed on the only gift I had left, the fragile art of putting love into words. Now, when I look back, I see that not all broken promises die. Some of them transform, some find new life in ways we never expect. I did not return to her as the man she had once loved, nor did I reclaim the future we had dreamed of. But a part of that love survived, reborn in the voice of a child who carried both her eyes and perhaps my blood. Maybe that is enough. Maybe survival is not only about enduring the nights on a bench or carrying the scars of battles no one asks about. Maybe it is also about discovering that even shattered lives can cast long shadows, long enough to touch those who come after us. And so, I keep the letter still, folded and worn, the ink fading, but the promise alive in memory. I carry it not as a burden now, but as a reminder that once, before the world fell apart, someone believed in me enough to wait. And though she could not wait forever, her belief was not wasted. It found its way into a child's hand, into the way he spoke my name, into the letters he now writes with care. That is my redemption. That is my peace. We share new stories every day. Real stories that move and inspire. Subscribe to the channel and stay with us, because somewhere in every life, even in lives broken by war, there is still a voice waiting to be heard.